The wind howled through the pines as Elizabeth Cruz stood on the cabin's weathered porch, tears streaming down her face in the pale morning light. Behind her, Timothy Kim's deep voice carried a gentleness that seemed impossible from such a formidable man. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said quietly, his words cutting through her carefully constructed facade like a blade through silk. The mountain air was sharp with the scent of snow and wood smoke, and in that moment, everything she had built to protect herself began to crumble. But this moment of raw honesty had been months in the making. Born from desperation and nurtured by the harsh realities of frontier life, Elizabeth's journey to this remote mountain cabin had begun in the suffocating parlors of Boston, where her stepfather's gambling debts had left her with a choice that was no choice at all. Marriage to his creditor, a man whose reputation preceded him like a shadow, or the uncertain promise of a mail-order arrangement with a stranger in the Colorado Territory. The letter had been brief, practical, devoid of romance but filled with a quiet dignity that spoke to something deep within her. Timothy Kim sought a wife to share the burdens of mountain life, someone willing to work alongside him in building something lasting. He offered protection, provision, and respect. He made no promises of love, but neither did he demand it. For Elizabeth, fleeing the suffocating expectations of polite society and the looming threat of an unwanted marriage, it seemed like salvation. The train journey west had been a blur of churning wheels and changing landscapes, each mile carrying her further from everything familiar. She had practiced her smile in the reflection of the window, rehearsed the cheerful demeanor she would present to her new husband. She would be the perfect frontier wife, grateful and uncomplaining, hiding the fear that gnawed at her stomach like hunger. She would make herself useful, indispensable, and perhaps in time, she might even find a measure of happiness. But the reality of mountain life proved harsher than any letter could convey. Timothy's cabin sat in a valley surrounded by peaks that scraped the sky, isolated from the nearest settlement by days of difficult travel. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through evergreens and the distant call of wildlife. For a woman accustomed to the constant hum of city life, the quiet felt oppressive, almost alive in its intensity. Timothy himself was nothing like the men she had known in Boston. Tall and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that spoke of endless labor, he moved through his domain with the quiet confidence of someone who had carved his place from wilderness through sheer determination. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, his skin weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the mountains themselves. He was a man shaped by solitude and hard work, comfortable in his own skin in a way that both intimidated and fascinated her. Their first weeks together had been a careful dance of politeness and mutual assessment. Elizabeth threw herself into the role of frontier wife with desperate determination, rising before dawn to tend the fire, preparing meals from their limited stores, mending clothes by lamplight. She smiled when exhaustion made her bones ache, laughed at Timothy's rare attempts at conversation, and never once complained about the isolation that sometimes made her feel as though she might disappear entirely. Timothy watched her with those thoughtful eyes, saying little but missing nothing. He was unfailingly courteous, treating her with a respect that was both comforting and somehow lonely. He never raised his voice, never made demands beyond the practical necessities of their shared life, and never once touched her beyond the brief contact required by daily routines. It was exactly what she had hoped for, and yet it left her feeling more isolated than ever. The mountains tested them both in ways she had never imagined. Early snows came without warning, trapping them in the cabin for days at a time. Supplies ran lower than expected when a late thaw delayed the supply wagon. A pack of wolves, driven down from higher elevations by hunger, began stalking their small herd of cattle. Each challenge required them to work together, to depend on one another in ways that slowly began to erode the careful barriers they had both constructed. Elizabeth discovered reserves of strength she had never known she possessed. When Timothy fell ill with fever, she nursed him through 3 days of delirium, forcing broth between his lips and keeping the fire burning through the long, cold nights. When the wolves finally made their move, she stood beside him with his father's old rifle, her hands steady despite her racing heart. When their last candle burned down to nothing, She learned to work by firelight, her fingers finding their way through familiar tasks in the dancing shadows. But it was the small moments that truly began to change them both. Timothy's quiet pride when she successfully preserved their late harvest. The way his eyes softened when she sang old hymns while working, her voice echoing in the cabin's close quarters. Elizabeth's growing appreciation for his steady presence. The way he anticipated problems before they became crises, the gentle way he handled injured animals. The realization that his silence was not indifference but a deep thoughtfulness that she had never encountered in the chattering social circles of her former life. As autumn deepened into winter, the pretense became harder to maintain. The constant cheerfulness felt increasingly hollow, especially during the long evenings when they sat by the fire, she with her mending and he with his whittling, the silence stretching between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Elizabeth found herself stealing glances at him, wondering what thoughts moved behind those dark eyes, what dreams or regrets he carried in the quiet spaces of his heart. The breaking point came with the first real blizzard of the season. Snow fell for 3 days and nights, piling against the windows and sealing them into their small world. The wind screamed like a living thing, rattling the shutters and finding every crack in the cabin's defenses. By the second day, Elizabeth's composure began to fray. The walls seemed to press closer with each passing hour, and the cheerful mask she wore felt heavier than iron. Timothy noticed, of course. He always noticed. But instead of the polite inquiry she expected, he simply began to talk. His voice was low and steady, weaving stories of his childhood in California. His father's struggles as an immigrant, seeking acceptance in a hostile land. The dreams that had driven him to these mountains in search of something he could build with his own hands. He spoke of loneliness that had become a familiar companion, of the satisfaction found in simple work well done, of the hope that had led him to write that first careful letter seeking a wife. His honesty was like a key turning in a lock Elizabeth hadn't realized existed. She found herself responding, not with the practiced pleasantries she had perfected, but with her own truths. She spoke of the suffocating expectations of Boston society, where a woman's worth was measured in her ability to smile and remain silent. She told him about her mother's death, her stepfather's weakness, the creditor whose eyes had made her skin crawl. She admitted her fear of being a disappointment, of not being strong enough for this life he had chosen. When the storm finally passed, something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful politeness remained, but underneath it ran a current of genuine understanding. They worked together with new efficiency, their movements coordinated by growing familiarity. Timothy began to share his thoughts about the land, his plans for expansion, his concerns about the coming winter. Elizabeth found herself offering opinions, suggestions, her mind engaged in ways it never had been in her former life. The change was gradual but unmistakable. Timothy's rare smiles became more frequent, and Elizabeth discovered that her own laughter, when it came, was genuine rather than performed. They developed small rituals, shared jokes, moments of companionable silence that felt comfortable rather than strained. When Timothy injured his hand while splitting wood, Elizabeth tended the wound with careful attention, her touch lingering longer than strictly necessary. When she struggled with a particularly difficult passage in her Bible, he sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers as he helped her work through the archaic language. But it was Timothy's quiet perceptiveness that truly began to undo her. He noticed when she was tired and quietly took over tasks without being asked. He saw through her determined optimism to the homesickness she tried to hide, and began sharing stories of his own displacement, his own struggles to find belonging. He recognized her intelligence and began asking for her opinions on everything from crop rotation to the best route for the spring cattle drive. Most unsettling of all, he saw through the performance she had perfected over months of practice. When she forced enthusiasm for tasks that clearly exhausted her, his eyes would grow thoughtful. When she insisted everything was fine while fighting back tears of frustration, he would find small ways to ease her burden without making her feel weak. He was dismantling her carefully constructed facade brick by brick, not through confrontation, but through kindness. The crisis came in early spring, when the snow began to melt and the world outside their cabin started to come alive again. A rider brought news from the nearest settlement, along with a letter that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. Her stepfather had died, and his creditor was making inquiries about her whereabouts. The man she had fled to avoid was not content to let her disappear into the wilderness. He wanted what he felt was owed to him, and he had the resources to pursue it. Timothy read the fear in her face before she could hide it, and for the first time since her arrival, he demanded the full truth. Elizabeth found herself pouring out the entire story, the words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain. She told him about the debts, the threats, the marriage that would have been little more than legalized slavery. She admitted that she had come to him not out of any desire for frontier life, but as a desperate escape from circumstances that had left her with no other choice. She expected anger, disappointment, perhaps even rejection. Instead, Timothy listened with growing fury, not at her deception, but at the men who had driven her to such desperate measures. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. Then he spoke with a conviction that surprised them both, telling her that no man had the right to claim a woman against her will, that her past circumstances changed nothing about her worth or her place in his home. But Elizabeth's relief was short-lived. The letter had mentioned that inquiries were being made, that her location might soon be discovered. The thought of bringing danger to Timothy, of disrupting the life he had built in these mountains, was unbearable. She began to make plans to leave, to disappear deeper into the wilderness where she could not be found. She told herself it was for his protection, but deep down, she knew it was also because she could not bear to see disappointment in his eyes when he realized what kind of trouble she had brought to his door. Timothy, with his uncanny ability to read her moods, sensed her withdrawal immediately. He watched her pack supplies with the efficiency she had learned over their months together, saw the way she avoided his eyes, recognized the signs of someone preparing to run. But instead of confronting her directly, he began to share more of himself, as if offering his own vulnerabilities might convince her to stay. He told her about his father's death, the way grief had driven him to these mountains in search of solitude. He spoke of the years of isolation, the way he had convinced himself that independence was the same as strength. He admitted that her presence had changed something fundamental in him, that the cabin felt empty when she was not in it, that he had begun to dream of a future that included more than mere survival. His honesty was both a gift and a torment. Elizabeth found herself torn between the growing feelings she had tried so hard to suppress and the fear that her past would destroy everything they had begun to build together. She loved the way he moved through his daily tasks with quiet competence, the way he listened when she spoke, the rare moments when his reserved demeanor gave way to something warmer. But love, she told herself, was a luxury she could not afford when her very presence might bring danger to his door. The morning she planned to leave, Timothy rose before dawn and found her standing on the porch, her traveling pack at her feet. The sun was just beginning to touch the mountain peaks, painting them gold and rose, and the air carried the promise of spring. Elizabeth had been crying, her tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold mountain air, and she was trying desperately to compose herself before he woke. But Timothy was already there, his presence solid and reassuring behind her. He did not ask where she was going or why. Instead, he moved to stand beside her, his own gaze fixed on the distant peaks, and spoke the words that would finally shatter the walls she had built around her heart. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said quietly. And in those simple words, Elizabeth heard everything she had been afraid to hope for. The pretense had been her armor, her way of making herself acceptable, useful, safe. But Timothy was telling her that she did not need armor with him, that he saw her clearly and chose her anyway. He was offering her something she had never had before, the freedom to be herself without fear of rejection or abandonment. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Elizabeth turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks, and saw in his eyes the same vulnerability she felt in her own heart. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he brushed the tears from her face with gentle fingers. The touch was electric, the first truly intimate contact they had shared, and it spoke of possibilities that neither had dared to voice. She found herself telling him everything she had held back, Not just about her past, but about her growing feelings for him, her fear of being a burden, her terror that love might make her weak when she needed to be strong. Timothy listened with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and when she finished, he shared his own fears, his own hopes, his own growing certainty that what they had found together was worth fighting for. The conversation stretched through the morning and into the afternoon. Two people finally dropping their guards and discovering the depth of connection that had been growing between them all along. Timothy made it clear that he would not let her face her past alone, that whatever came, they would meet it together. Elizabeth, for her first time in her life, allowed herself to believe that she had found someone who would not abandon her when circumstances became difficult. When the creditor's men finally came, 3 weeks later, they found not a frightened woman hiding in the wilderness, but a united front that would not be moved. Timothy stood beside Elizabeth on their porch, his rifle in his hands and his resolve written clearly on his face. Elizabeth, no longer the desperate girl who had fled Boston, met their demands with quiet dignity and absolute refusal. The confrontation was brief but decisive. The men had expected to find an isolated woman, easy to intimidate and remove. Instead, they found a couple prepared to defend their home and each other, backed by neighbors who had ridden over when Timothy sent word of the threat. The mountain community, sparse as it was, had its own code, and that code did not include allowing outsiders to drag away women against their will. Faced with determined resistance and no legal standing in the territory, the men retreated, but not before making threats about returning with proper authority. Elizabeth watched them ride away with a mixture of relief and lingering fear, but Timothy's steady presence beside her made it clear that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their cabin, Timothy took Elizabeth's hand in his own work-roughened palm and spoke words that completed the transformation that had been months in the making. He told her that he loved her, not for the cheerful facade she had presented or the useful skills she had developed, but for the strength he had seen her display in moments of crisis, the intelligence she brought to their shared challenges, the courage it had taken to flee an impossible situation and build a new life from nothing. Elizabeth, her own hand steady in his, found the words to tell him that she loved him too, that somewhere in the long winter evenings and shared struggles, gratitude had deepened into something far more precious. She loved his quiet strength, his thoughtful nature, the way he had seen through her pretense to the woman beneath and chosen to cherish both her vulnerabilities and her capabilities. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, the culmination of months of growing trust and understanding. It tasted of spring air and new beginnings, of a future built not on desperation, but on choice freely made. When they broke apart, Elizabeth felt as though she had finally come home, not just to this mountain cabin, but to herself. The spring and summer that followed were a time of building in every sense. Timothy expanded the cabin, adding rooms that spoke of permanence and hope for the future. Elizabeth planted a garden that would feed them through the next winter, her hands confident in the soil she now thought of as her own. They worked side by side, their partnership deepened by honesty and strengthened by shared purpose. When autumn came again, bringing with it the anniversary of Elizabeth's arrival, they celebrated not just her survival, but her transformation. The frightened girl who had stepped off the supply wagon had become a woman capable of facing whatever challenges the mountains might offer. The lonely man who had written a careful letter seeking companionship had found instead a partner who matched his strength with her own. The mountains that had once seemed forbidding now felt like protection, their peaks standing guard over the life Elizabeth and Timothy had built together. The isolation that had once threatened to swallow her had become a gift, offering them space to discover who they truly were when stripped of society's expectations and demands. As winter approached once more, Elizabeth stood on the same porch where she had once planned to flee, but now the view filled her with contentment rather than despair. The cabin behind her was warm with firelight and the promise of shared evenings. The man who had once been a stranger now knew her heart as well as his own. The future, while still uncertain, held possibilities that made her eager for each new day. Timothy joined her on the porch, his arms settling around her waist with familiar ease. Together, They watched the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled not with things unsaid but with deep understanding. "You were right," Elizabeth said softly, her words carried away by the mountain wind. "I did not have to pretend with you." Timothy's response was a gentle squeeze, his own way of saying that he had known from the beginning what it had taken her months to discover. She had always been enough, exactly as she was. The story of their courtship would become legend in the scattered mountain communities, told around fires during long winter evenings. It was a tale of two people who had found in each other not just companionship, but the courage to be completely themselves. Elizabeth Cruz, the mail-order bride who had arrived in tears, had discovered that sometimes the most frightening journeys lead to the most precious destinations. In the end, it was not the mountain that had changed her, though its challenges had certainly tested her strength. It was not Timothy's love alone, though that had provided the safety she needed to grow. It was the discovery that she had always possessed the courage and capability she thought she lacked, and that the right person could help her see those qualities in herself. The pretense she had maintained for so long had not been protection but prison, keeping her isolated from genuine connection and authentic joy. When Timothy told her she did not have to pretend with him, he had offered her the greatest gift possible, the freedom to be completely herself and discover that herself was enough. Years later, when supply wagons brought news of the outside world, Elizabeth would sometimes hear stories of women trapped in circumstances similar to those she had fled. She would think of her younger self, desperate and afraid, convinced that deception was her only armor against a hostile world. She would remember the weight of that constant performance, the exhaustion of never being able to rest in her own skin. To those women, if they had asked, she would have offered the wisdom earned through her own transformation. She would have told them that strength was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. That authenticity was not weakness, but the foundation of genuine connection. That sometimes the most terrifying leap led to the softest landing. The mountain community that had rallied to protect her during that confrontation with her past had become her extended family, proof that chosen bonds could be as strong as blood. The neighbors who had ridden to their defense had done so not out of obligation, but out of respect for the woman Elizabeth had become, and the man Timothy had always been. Their cabin, expanded and improved over the years, had become a way station for other travelers seeking new beginnings in the territory. Elizabeth took particular pleasure in welcoming women who arrived with the same haunted look she had once worn, showing them through her example that reinvention was possible, that the past did not have to define the future. Timothy, his hair now touched with silver at the temples, remained the steady presence that had first drawn her to trust him. But their relationship had deepened beyond the careful partnership of their early days into something richer and more complex. They had learned to navigate disagreements with respect, to support each other through difficulties, to celebrate successes together. The garden Elizabeth had planted in their first spring had grown into an abundant source of food and beauty, its success a testament to what could flourish when tended with patience and care. Like their marriage, it required constant attention, but rewarded that attention with abundance beyond what either had imagined possible. When winter storms trapped them in the cabin now, the time felt like a gift rather than a trial. They had learned to treasure the quiet evenings, the intimate conversations, the simple pleasure of shared tasks. The isolation that had once terrified Elizabeth had become precious, a protection for the love they had built together. The mail-order arrangement that had brought them together had long since evolved into something neither contract nor convention could adequately describe. They were partners in the truest sense, each contributing unique strengths to their shared life, each supporting the other through challenges that would have overwhelmed them individually. Elizabeth's transformation from frightened refugee to confident mountain woman had not happened overnight, but it had been thorough and lasting. She had discovered reserves of courage, intelligence, and capability that her former life had never allowed her to explore. More importantly, she had learned to value these qualities in herself, to see them as assets rather than aberrations. Timothy, for his part, had learned that his self-imposed isolation had been a form of protection that had outlived its usefulness. Elizabeth's presence had taught him that vulnerability shared with the right person became strength, that his careful independence had been loneliness disguised as virtue. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone. The creditor, who had once pursued Elizabeth, had eventually given up his chase, discouraged by distance and the lack of legal recourse in the territory. But even if he had persisted, Elizabeth knew she would no longer be the same frightened woman who had once fled his demands. She had found her voice, her strength, her place in the world. As she stood on the porch that evening, watching the familiar dance of light and shadow across the mountain peaks, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The tears she had shed on this same porch months earlier seemed like artifacts from another life, evidence of a woman who no longer existed. The mountain man who had whispered those transformative words to her that morning had given her more than comfort. He had given her permission to be herself, fully and completely, without apology or pretense. In accepting that gift, she had discovered not just love, but the person she had always been meant to be. The wind that had once carried her tears now carried her laughter, the sound echoing off the peaks like a promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did. But Elizabeth faced them with confidence, born of hard-won self-knowledge. She no longer needed to pretend with Timothy or with anyone else. She had learned that her authentic self was not just acceptable, but precious, worthy of love and respect and protection. The story that had begun with deception and desperation had become one of truth and fulfillment. Elizabeth Cruz had arrived as a mail-order bride, a woman playing a role she thought was required for survival. She had become simply Elizabeth, Timothy's wife and partner, a woman who knew her own worth and was not afraid to claim her place in the world. The mountains that surrounded their home stood as silent witnesses to this transformation, their peaks unchanged by the human drama played out in their shadow. But for Elizabeth, they had become something more than landscape. They were the foundation of the life she had chosen, the backdrop for the love she had found, the guardians of the future she was still writing. When Timothy joined her on the porch, his presence, as comforting as it had been that first morning, when he had seen through her tears to the truth beneath, Elizabeth felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. She had taken the greatest risk possible, allowing herself to be known completely by another person, and had discovered that the reward was beyond anything she could have imagined. The mail-order bride who had arrived in tears had found something more precious than security or even love. She had found herself authentic and unafraid, worthy of the life she had built and the man who shared it with her. In learning that she did not have to pretend, Elizabeth had discovered that reality was far more beautiful than any facade she could have constructed. The mountain wind carried the scent of snow and pine, the promise of another winter to weather together, another spring to celebrate their survival and growth. Elizabeth breathed deeply, no longer the frightened woman who had once stood in this same spot planning her escape. She was home, finally and completely, in every sense of the word that mattered.